The image is grainy, a flickering 1/6 millimeter reel of a world in collapse. It is May 1945. Berlin is a skeleton of stone and twisted rebar. In the silence that followed the final artillery barrage, a different kind of war was beginning, one fought not with tanks, but with filing cabinets and personnel folders. While the world celebrated the end of the greatest conflict in human history, a small group of American intelligence officers was moving through the ruins with a very specific list of names. These were not names of war criminals to be prosecuted, at least not initially. They were the names of the minds behind the V-2 rocket, the Me-262 jet fighter, and the chilling advances in chemical warfare developed within the laboratories of the Third Reich. History tells us that the United States brought these men across the Atlantic to win the space race. But the official narrative often skips over a more unsettling detail: the systematic cleansing of their pasts. In the decades that followed, researchers visiting the National Archives began to notice something strange. Files that should have been there were missing. Cross-references led to empty folders. It appeared that as the 1,600 scientists were being integrated into American life, the records of who they were and what they had done between 1933 and 1945 were being quietly, methodically removed. But to understand why these records vanished, we have to go back to the moment the first folders were opened. In the final weeks of the war, as the Allied lines squeezed the German resistance into a shrinking pocket, a secret American unit known as the Alsos mission was operating just behind the front lines. Their objective was the Osenberg List. Named after Werner Osenberg, a scientist who had headed the Reich Research Council, the list was a catalogue of Germany's most brilliant scientific minds. Legend has it that the list was found partially destroyed, stuffed into a toilet in a University of Bonn laboratory, a frantic last-minute attempt to keep it out of Allied hands. The recovery of that list changed everything. It revealed that Germany's technological edge wasn't just a matter of a few brilliant individuals, but a massive, state-sponsored machine of innovation. The Americans realized that if they didn't capture these men, the Soviets would. This realization created a moral vacuum. The question was no longer, what did these men do? But rather, what can they do for us? However, there was a significant obstacle. President Harry Truman had issued a strict directive. No high-ranking Nazi Party members or active supporters of Nazi militarism were to be recruited. On paper, the policy was clear. In practice, it was an impossibility. Almost every scientist of note in the Third Reich had been a member of the party, some by necessity, many by choice. And that's when the paperclips began to appear. In the temporary detention centers in Germany, known as Dustbin, intelligence officers began sorting through the dossiers of the captured scientists. If a scientist was deemed vital to American interests, but had a problematic history such as membership in the SS or involvement in slave labor, a simple metal paperclip was attached to his file. It was a silent signal to the visa processors. It meant, bypass the background check. The name Operation Paperclip would eventually become synonymous with this era, but at the time, it was a shadow operation. The goal was to bring these men to America under a veil of total secrecy. But as the first groups arrived at Fort Strong in Boston Harbor, a new problem emerged. The scientists had memories, and more importantly, they had records. And those records contained details that could never be made public if these men were to become the new faces of American progress. The American public in 1946 was not ready to welcome the men who had designed the rockets that fell on London. The memory of the war was too fresh, the scars too deep. To solve this, a process of rehabilitation began. It wasn't just about changing their clothes or teaching them English. It was about rewriting their biographies. Historians who have spent years tracking these records have found a recurring pattern. The scientist who was listed in 1945 as a dedicated follower of the party would, by 1947, have his file updated to reflect reluctant participation or nominal membership. In some cases, entire sections of their military service records simply ceased to exist. But as the Cold War began to freeze the world into two opposing blocs, the stakes grew higher. The fear of Soviet technological superiority outweighed the demands of justice. The scientists were moved from military installations to civilian laboratories, to NASA, and to the hallowed halls of American universities. Yet, there were those within the government who were deeply unsettled by this. Samuel Goudsmit, the scientific head of the Alsos mission, was one of them. Goudsmit had spent the war hunting for German atomic secrets, only to return home and find that his own parents had been killed in the Holocaust. He watched with a mixture of horror and professional fascination as the very men who had served the regime that murdered his family were given comfortable lives and prestigious positions in the United States. Goudsmit's private letters suggest a man haunted by what he saw. He noted that many of the scientists showed no remorse, viewing their work as purely technical, divorced from the human cost. But his voice was drowned out by the drums of the Cold War. The Pentagon argued that a single German scientist was worth 10 divisions of infantry. As the 1950s dawned, the rehabilitated scientists were becoming household names. Wernher von Braun, the man who had built the V-2 at the horrific Mittelbau-Dora slave labor complex, was appearing on Disney television specials, charming the American public with visions of space travel. He was presented as a dreamer, a man whose only desire was to reach the stars. The records of what happened at Mittelbau-Dora, the thousands of prisoners who died in the tunnels building those rockets, were kept in classified files, away from the eyes of the journalists interviewing von Braun. But even the most carefully guarded secrets have a way of leaking. In the late 1940s, a whistleblower within the Department of State began to raise alarms about the moral compromise of Operation Paperclip. They pointed out that some of the scientists being brought over were not just nominal Nazis, but had been involved in human experimentation and the management of concentration camp labor. The response from the intelligence community was swift. The records weren't just classified, they were dispersed. Files were moved from the National Archives to military repositories, then to private storage, and in some cases, they were simply checked out and never returned. Some researchers believe this was a deliberate strategy to create a fragmented history where no single person could see the full picture of who these 1,600 men really were. And that's when the gaps in the archives began to truly widen. By the mid-1950s, the integration was nearly complete. The scientists were no longer enemy aliens. They were German, Americans contributing to the defense of the free world. Their pasts had been effectively sanitized, replaced by a narrative of redemption and scientific necessity. But what about the documents that didn't fit this narrative? What happened to the testimonies of the survivors who recognized these men? And what of the internal memos where American officers debated the ethics of hiring war criminals? As it turns out, the paper trail didn't just end, it was actively being rewritten. In the labyrinthine halls of the Pentagon, a new project was underway to ensure that the paperclip legacy would remain untarnished, even if it meant the quiet removal of thousands of pages from the public record. But as the decades passed and the Cold War reached its peak, a new generation of investigators began to ask questions that the previous generation had been too afraid or too busy to ask. They began to notice that the official stories of these men often contained impossible contradictions. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. The investigation into the missing records didn't begin in a courtroom, but in the quiet, dust-moated aisles of the National Archives during the late 1970s. A new generation of researchers, many of whom had no living memory of the war, began requesting the personnel files of high-ranking NASA and Department of Defense consultants. What they found was a series of jarring inconsistencies. In many cases, a scientist's file would begin in 1945 with a detailed, often harrowing account of their activities during the war, mentions of SS rank, oversight of forced labor, or membership in radical political organizations. But as the researchers turned the pages, they noticed something peculiar. Inserted into these dossiers were newer revised biographies, often dated between 1947 and 1952. These revised documents frequently contradicted the earlier entries, downplaying the individuals' roles in the Nazi Party or omitting their wartime activities entirely. It was as if two different men were being described in the same folder. Records suggest that this wasn't the result of administrative error. In 1947, the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, or GIOA, the body responsible for Operation Paperclip, found itself in a bureaucratic tug-of-war with the State Department. The State Department was still adhering to Truman's ban on recruiting high-profile Nazis. To bypass this, the GIOA began creating clean versions of the scientists' dossiers. When the State Department requested the files for visa approval, they were often sent the sanitized versions. The original, more damning records were kept in separate, highly classified working files. Over time, many of these original files simply disappeared from the primary archives. Some historians believe they were destroyed, while others suggest they were transferred to private military repositories that remain off-limits to the public even today. And that's when things began to shift from a matter of bureaucratic shuffling to something far more systemic. As the researchers dug deeper, they encountered the case of Arthur Rudolph. To the American public of the 1960s, Rudolph was a hero, the project manager for the Saturn V rocket that took men to the moon. He had been awarded the NASA Distinguished Service Medal, but his early records, the ones that had been buried for decades, told a different story. They linked him directly to the management of the Middlework facility, where V-2 rockets were produced by concentration camp prisoners under conditions of unimaginable cruelty. The realization was staggering. The very man who helped the United States win the space race had been, according to these rediscovered documents, a key figure in a system that saw thousands of human beings worked to death. This revelation created a fracture in the American narrative. How could the same hands that built the chariot of Apollo also have directed the horrors of the tunnels? But Rudolph was just one name among 1,600. The scale of the rehabilitation was much larger than anyone had suspected. It wasn't just about rocket scientists. It extended to chemical weapons experts, physicians who had conducted high-altitude experiments on prisoners, and intelligence officers who had served in the Gestapo. In the mid-1980s, the Office of Special Investigations, or OSI, a branch of the Department of Justice tasked with hunting Nazi war criminals, began to pull on these threads. They found that in several instances, the GIOA had actively suppressed evidence of war crimes to protect their assets. One internal memo, dated 1948, described the scientists' records as valuable property of the United States government, implying that their pasts were less important than their potential future contributions. This led to a chilling discovery. The process of removing records wasn't just about hiding the past from the public, it was about hiding it from other branches of the government. The military was, in effect, running a private immigration system, one that operated outside the laws of the land. Yet, there is no clear consensus on who exactly authorized the final removal of these documents from the National Archives. Some believe it was a decentralized effort by individual handlers who had grown close to their scientists. Others point to a more coordinated effort within the higher echelons of the Pentagon. What is known is that by the time the OSI began its work, many of the most critical folders were either empty or contained withdrawal. Notices, slips of paper, indicating that a document had been removed for national security reasons. One such document involved a scientist named Kurt Blohm. Blohm had been the deputy Reich health leader and had been tried at Nuremberg for crimes against humanity, specifically for his role in biological warfare experiments. Though he was acquitted at Nuremberg, a verdict that remains controversial to this day, American intelligence was eager to hire him. Records suggest that Blohm's expertise in plague and sarin gas was considered so vital that his file was subjected to an unprecedented level of cleansing. When researchers later tried to reconstruct his recruitment, they found that nearly every document related to his arrival in the United States had been quietly moved to a restricted category that required special clearance just to acknowledge its existence. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. As the 1990s approached, the declassification of certain Cold War documents under the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act began to shed light on the human cost of this silence. It wasn't just about the records that were missing. It was about the voices that had been silenced in their place. Survivors of the labor camps, who had seen these scientists in the factories and laboratories of the Reich, had been trying to speak out for years. Their letters to the Justice Department and the FBI often went unanswered. In the archives, investigators found dozens of these letters, some of them tucked into the back of personnel files, never having been followed up on. The slow burn of justice had been stalled by a wall of paper. One of the most poignant examples is the story of a former prisoner who recognized a prominent American university professor as the same man who had overseen medical trials in a camp. The survivor's testimony was detailed and harrowing. But when investigators looked for the professor's wartime file to verify the claim, they found that the years 1941 to 1944 were a complete blank, a missing chapter that no one could explain. This raises a haunting question. How much of our modern world, our medicines, our jet engines, our satellite communications is built upon a foundation of erased history? The tension between the scientific progress these men provided and the moral compromise of their recruitment began to boil over. The American public, once enamored with the German geniuses, started to see them in a more complex, darker light. The hero worship of the 1950s was replaced by the legal depositions of the 1980s. But as the investigators moved closer to the truth, they hit a final, insurmountable barrier. They discovered that a significant portion of the paperclip records had not just been misplaced or reclassified. They had been subject to a process known as discretionary destruction. Under certain government regulations, files that are deemed no longer of administrative value can be destroyed. In the case of the 1600, the records of their recruitment and the vetting of their pasts were, in many instances, designated for destruction just as the investigations were picking up steam. This leads us to a disturbing realization. The disappearance of these records may not have been a one-time event in 1945, but a continuous process of erasure that lasted for decades. And that's when the investigation took a turn toward the present. The hunt for the truth was no longer just about the men of 1945. It was about the institutions that had protected them. It was about the way history is curated, and what happens when the curators decide that certain truths are too dangerous to be kept. The passage of the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act in 1998 was supposed to be the final reckoning. It was a massive undertaking, resulting in the declassification of over 8 million pages of documents. For the first time, the public would have access to the inner workings of the GIOA and the individual files of the 1600 scientists. Historians braced themselves for a flood of answers. But as the boxes were opened in the research rooms of the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, they found that the transparency was far from absolute. While millions of pages were released, many arrived with heavy redactions thick, black lines covering names, dates, and locations. Even more troubling were the withdrawal sheets that remained in the folders. These are small slips of paper that indicate a document has been removed and remains classified. In many of the most sensitive paperclip files, these slips are the only thing left of the wartime years. Some historians believe these redactions are not just about protecting the reputation of the deceased, but about protecting the methods of the intelligence agencies that recruited them methodically. What was being guarded wasn't just the past, but the blueprints of how a government can successfully manufacture a new identity for an inconvenient but useful person. But there was a final layer to this story that even the most seasoned investigators hadn't anticipated. It lies in the case of Hubertus Strughold, often referred to as the father of space medicine. For decades, Strughold was a titan of American science. A library was named after him. He was credited with the innovations that allowed astronauts to survive the vacuum of space. His record, according to his official American biography, was impeccable. He was portrayed as a man of science who had stayed above the political fray of the Third Reich. However, as the Disclosure Act's documents began to circulate, a more complex image emerged. Records suggested that Strughold had been present at a 1942 conference, where the results of cold chamber experiments on prisoners at Dachau were discussed in detail. These experiments involved immersing human beings in ice water until they died, to study the effects of hypothermia on Luftwaffe pilots. While there was no evidence that Strughold personally conducted the experiments, the documents suggested he was aware of them, and more importantly, that he had utilized the data they produced. When this information came to light in the 1990s, his name was quietly removed from the library and his portrait was taken down. But the most revealing part of the Strughold case wasn't what was found, it was how long it had been known. Internal memos from the 1950s revealed that American intelligence officers had already been aware of Strughold's presence at that conference. They had deliberately chosen to omit it from his public-facing file. This was the paperclip system, functioning exactly as intended. A selective editing of history, where the administrative value of a man's knowledge outweighed the moral weight of his associations. And yet, despite the millions of pages released, the count of 1,600 scientists remains a subject of quiet debate. Some researchers believe the number was actually much higher, and that the records of the lower-tier recruits were never even entered into the National Archives to begin with. These were the men who went to work for private corporations, their arrivals facilitated by the military, but their employment kept off the government books. What happened next remains unclear. As the 21st century progresses, the last of the paperclip scientists have passed away. The living links to that era are gone, leaving only the paper trail, or the lack of one. In the modern era, we are left to grapple with a world that was, in part, built by these men. Every time we use a GPS device, every time we look at a high-resolution image of a distant planet, we are interacting with the legacy of a program that required the erasure of history to succeed. We live in the house that paperclip built, even if we've lost the blueprints for its foundation. There is a certain irony in the fact that the very archives, meant to preserve our history, became the site of its quietest deletions. The missing folders and the blacked-out names serve as a silent monument to a time when the world was so terrified of its future that it decided to forget its past. Some argue that the ends justified the means, that the technological leap provided by these 1,600 minds saved millions of lives during the Cold War and pushed humanity into the stars. Others believe that the cost was too high, that by sanitizing the records of these men, the United States didn't just recruit scientists, it recruited a culture of moral compartmentalization that still lingers in the halls of power today. The documents that were quietly removed from the National Archives may never be recovered. They may have been fed into shredders in the 1950s or burned in the 1970s, but their absence remains a tangible thing. It is a gap in the narrative, a hollow space in the story of the 20th century. As we look back at the flickering footage of May 1945, the image of the soldier with the list of names takes on a different meaning. He wasn't just looking for scientists. He was the first architect of a new kind of silence. A silence that was carefully maintained for over half a century, and one that still informs the way we choose what to remember and what to allow to fade. The files of Operation Paperclip are no longer just about the men they describe. They are about the nature of truth in an age of total war. They remind us that history is not just what happened, but what we are allowed to know. And in the quiet corners of the National Archives, among the withdrawal sheets and the redacted paragraphs, the full story of the 1600 remains what it has always been. A puzzle with pieces missing by design. The archives are still there. The researchers still visit. But as the ink on the remaining documents fades, the truth of what was lost becomes harder to find. We are left with a legacy that is as brilliant as it is shadowed, a testament to a world that chose progress over a difficult truth.